Hey, folks, it is December the 10th, and we're going to finish up our discussion over World War II. Now, tomorrow is a B day, so we normally meet for our U.S. history class, the regular one. But we're not going to meet tomorrow for a lecture because it's going to be review day. What I'm going to want you to do is to use that time, study your notes, and prepare yourself because on Tuesday, I'm going to post your test in the Google Classroom. It's going to be multiple choice with an essay prompt. Now, essay prompt is going to have to do with um, of course, World War II. But your questions are going to be over both World War II and also the Great Depression, if I remember correctly. So, but I'm going to let you know more about that when I post your study guidance and your review guidance in the Google Classroom. So I will post that for you so you know where to go and all that good stuff. But World War II is your main focus. All right, so if you'll recall, Victory in Europe Day, or known as VE Day, was May the 8th, 1945. So this was a day of massive celebration for much of the world, especially people who were in England and in Europe and Nazi-held territory. So the war was over for a lot of people, but it wasn't over for us. Because if you recall, we got into this war in the first place because of an attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy. So this is a picture of prisoners of war being freed from a Nazi war camp. Um, prisoners of war were treated differently according to what country they came from. So you could have prisoners of war who were prisoners from America, and in that same camp, you would have prisoners of war from Russia. Well, the prisoners of war from America were treated better because organizations like the Red Cross were able to send care packages to these POWs and get them extra food and clothing, things like that. The Russians never gained such a thing. So a lot of them would starve. But this was very hard for the Americans because they faced torture, um, they faced interrogations, of course, humiliation, sickness, illness, disease, and death. So it was pretty hard. So, though Americans celebrated the victory in Europe, the war was still fully active against Japan. Yeah, just like I just said. The Japanese strategy was to force the U.S. into invading a nearly innumerable amount of heavily fortified islands while losing massive numbers of troops and equipment. So remember, like I told you, the Japanese occupied all of these jungle and desert islands. They dug themselves in. They left troops with machine guns, artillery pieces, mines, mortars, all of these methods of defending themselves and killing American soldiers. However, the American war planners realized that only key islands needed to be seized, while most others could be bypassed and isolated. So we would use our Navy, Marines, Army, and air power to only hit the important islands we wanted. And we would leapfrog over the ones we didn't think were important. And we would leave those Japanese soldiers there. They had no boats to get off. We cut them off from their supplies, and they were rendered harmless. And so it was one way to save our lives and resources and just kind of prevent a fight from happening. So it's pretty smart. As General MacArthur continued to push through the northern coast of New Guinea, the Navy and Marines continued to take the Solomon Islands. So remember, I told you we split into two halves, and one half was going along the south towards Japan, freeing areas along the way, and we had the other going through the north, freeing areas as they were going along towards Japan as well. By 1944, MacArthur was ready to take the Philippines. Remember, he's the general who had to flee the Philippines during that surprise attack in the first place. while the Navy and Marines were establishing foothills in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. So a lot of these places that we're actually taking away from the Japanese will become American protectorates after the war. And what that means is that these places are mostly independent, but where the U.S. kept the power to keep military bases there and stuff like that, and to shoo off other nations from trying to control them. Of course, many of them had their own native populations. Some of them, like the Marshall Islands, still had people who were very, very simple hut-dwelling people who lived on fish, and they didn't they like very simple prehistoric lifestyles, as a lot of these places did. So kind of neat. So yeah, the main point is we're making it to Japan. Y'all ready to move on?
I'm behind on notes, so I'm still like
Uh,
a
you're s-
little bit behind.
oh, that's okay. That's okay. So you pulled it up on the classroom and all? Okay. I'll go ahead and move on. All right. So here we have the picture of U.S. Marines fording a coastline on one of these islands. These islands aren't really uniform, though. Many of them did have some jungle forest on them. A lot of the islands that the Japanese occupied essentially had almost nothing on them. Some islands were able to ford with relatively little danger. Some, however, were like their own little D-days, where soldiers or Marines would have to get on the beach, which was heavily fired upon and rigged with all kinds of booby traps and things like that. But when they were fighting, they of course found that the Japanese were extremely fierce, almost always choosing death over even being captured. Um, so it was really tough stuff. In November of 1943, U.S. Marines overcame 5,000 well entrenched Japanese soldiers who fought to the death, nearly to a man, while the Marines took around 3,000 casualties. So, um, these are heavy losses. They really are. If you're going to usually, like, what you consider very high losses in a military conflict would be like 10%. But here you see that our casualties compared to who we overcame was well over 50%. So that's like really, really hard. If you casualties mean that these guys weren't necessarily killed, though many of them were. Well, they were wounded and rendered incapable of fighting in the next battle. So you can't go on like that forever. You can't constantly start losing troops um, for humane reasons, for one, but also because they're hard to replace. At Saipan, the Japanese defenders included around 22,000 civilians who expended all of their ammo and chose suicide over surrender. So even the Japanese civilians that were there, not all, necessarily the soldiers, were still joining in the fight. And they were choosing to die rather than to have Americans capture them. Part of it had to do with for cultural reasons. Culturally, the idea of surrendering to the enemy was it was like the greatest dishonor. It was itself worse than death. But also from propaganda, these folks believed that Americans were just extremely brutal monsters. and that all kinds of horrible things would happen to them if they were captured. The U.S. forces then established airfields on the newly acquired islands of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. With these airfields, long-range B-29 bombers began air raids over Japan. So, by taking some of these islands that are closer to Japan, we are now able to start attacking their homeland. And it's from these bases later on that we're going to be able to load up bombers with the 2 atomic bombs that will be used that will end the war. So, it's getting closer. By October 1944, American troops landed at the center of the Philippines. And if you recall, America gained control of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. It had its own native population, Pacific Island people, heavily influenced, of course, by their own tribal customs, which they had, but also they had been controlled by the Japanese in the past. Then America gained it from Spain after Spain went over and colonized it. So the Japanese attempted to halt the invasion of the Philippines in the largest naval battle in history at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. So it's like all or nothing. Of course, we already had that massive victory at Midway, which was a major turning point. However, here we're going to see that the Japanese are going to exhaust their last attempt to stop us. Because the Philippines, it's southwest of Japan, but it's really, really close. Of course, here we have a picture of a U.S. aircraft carrier. And so you can see it's essentially it's a battleship that has a runway on it so that airplanes can land and take off on it. And of course, on the right-hand side of it, you can see some planes there. And crashing into it, which the sailors are desperately trying to shoot out of the air, is a Japanese kamikaze. These are suicide flyers who would load up their aircraft with explosives, not even bothering with weighing it down with ammunition or bombs that they could drop, or even extra fuel and a fuel to get back home. Their entire purpose was to aim this as a human missile to try to sink American aircraft. It wasn't very effective. It didn't take out too many of our resources, or lives, but it was extremely scary to our service members. So it goes to show, however, also the desperation and just like the hardcore tenacity of the Japanese fighters. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the American Navy broke the remaining elements of the Japanese Navy and air power, as we mentioned before. By the spring of 1945, U.S. forces assaulted Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Once again, we're getting closer to Japan. Japan turned to a new weapon, the kamikaze, which loaded fighter planes with explosives while pilots suicide dived into the U.S. naval ships. I got the Philippines and Okinawa mixed up earlier when I was talking about Japan was in charge of it a long time ago. As U.S. Marines assaulted Iwo Jima, Nearly 21,000 Japanese soldiers fought to the death while causing the Americans to lose up to one-third of its invading forces. Nearly 7,000 dead and 20,000 injured. So once again, I told you 10% is a devastating loss for a military. To lose a third, this was looking bad for us. And you're always you're always at a disadvantage when you're trying to take over a defending element. They already know everything. They have everything where they want it. But that doesn't mean the defender's going to win. In the assault on Okinawa, things were worse. Japan mobilized 900 kamikazes against our Navy. By the time Okinawa fell, 12,000 American soldiers, 110,000 Japanese, and 160,000 civilians were dead. That includes, of course, the people of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. So a lot of people, of course, caught in the crossfire. The Japanese were notorious for whenever they would take an area, they would have the locals do slave labor for them. And so some of this would be by putting them in dangerous situations, carrying supplies for the Japanese during battles and things like that, not allowing them to flee and seek safety. So it was just terrible. All right, let's go on. All right, so here we have the world's first complete atomic bomb. Of course, there was an attempt towards an experimental atomic bomb by the Nazis, but fortunately, a lot of the supplies needed for it were actually destroyed before they could make it all the way to the Nazi place where they were going to start doing their experiments and stuff like that. It was either I don't remember if it was Swiss or no, Swedish soldiers who went behind enemy lines. They mountaineered and they skied up to a train track and then sabotaged it and blew up the train that was carrying something called heavy water, which is one of the components for manufacturing, I think, depleted uranium, but I'm not really sure. All right, so the Manhattan Project was a U.S. government-funded project where we had some of the leading physicists in the world come together and start developing a new kind of bomb. And the number of casualties was astonishing to the U.S. leadership, and it really was, leading many planners to indicate that taking the Japanese islands could cost 1 million American lives. The atomic bomb was an enticing answer to this dilemma. The Manhattan Project, begun in 1941, had produced a new type of bomb involving plutonium and uranium to create a massive explosion through a controlled chain reaction. So they have to get these weapons-grade nuclear materials, and they essentially put it in the center of the bomb. And simultaneously, all at once, they surround it with explosives all around in a circle. And this explosion happens all at once and creates so much pressure in the center that these atoms split. releasing an insane amount of energy. Teams of scientists under the leadership of J.R. Oppenheimer and Edwards Teller conducted this $2 billion research project in secret until their first successful detonation in 1945. The news of this testing reached President Truman as he was meeting with Churchill and Stalin just outside of Berlin. So, if you'll recall, FDR, he won the fourth term as president, but he passed away during the war. So, Truman, his vice president, became president. And so it rested on his shoulders what to do with this. It's like the war against the Germans is over. Italy has been defeated, but they still had to face Japan. And it looked like it was turning out to be an even tougher battle, especially regarding how many people we were losing. And not to mention that, like all those civilians, like that's a natural consequence of war, especially modern war. It's always the civilian populations. It's the innocent people who always suffer the most. All right. So this is what's known as an atomic shadow. And so whenever the bombs went off, they had such an intense flash that it burnt and bleached everything that the flash touched. However, things that were in the way of the flash kind of left this darker shade as you see here.
That's crazy. I don't know that.
Hmm?
I never knew that they did that.
Oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of them actually. People on their bicycle, they're just evaporated. You know, they're just vaporized into nothing, into just molecules. Such as this poor little girl on her jump rope, like literally within a flash, she was gone. And where she was, all that was left was this shadow. Very. My wife, she went to Japan and she went to the Hiroshima Museum, and she said, "Yeah, it was pretty crazy." There's like they had this big ball hanging in the museum exactly where the bomb went off. I was like crazy. So the nuclear age begins. Truman wished to keep this new weapon secret. The Soviet spies had already informed Stalin. So Truman's like, "Wow, we got this new super weapon. Don't tell anybody." Too late. The Russians already found out. And he used it on Japan in order to end the war without invasion. So they were hoping that this would scare them so much that, they declare peace. And maybe we could at least limit the casualties, right? Truman then released what was known as the Potsdam Declaration in July 1945, in which he demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. Japan knew it was losing the war and knew that the Americans were going to come. So they pleaded with Stalin to act as a middleman and negotiate peace on an even playing field. So Japan was like, "Hey, Russia, you're not fighting us right now. Will you please talk to America and let's just try to have, instead of an unconditional surrender, we can just call it good." But Truman convinced Stalin to take our side in the matter. So following Japan's rejection of the Potsdam Declaration, they're like, "No, we will not unconditionally surrender," ordered the use of the atomic bomb. 9:15 a.m. on August the 6th, 1945, the B-29 bomber known as the Enola Gay dropped the first bomb over Hiroshima, home of 250,000 people. So And this was chosen because this was a major, if I remember, as a major industrial city. So they made a lot of war supplies and stuff like that for the Japanese. And so by attacking this city, they wanted to get rid of its industrial sector. Yeah. Yeah. I think we got one more after this. There's one or two. There's one or two. There you go.
No.
Mm.
She looks like she doesn't believe you.
He looks like she wants to sleep.
Hmm.
I think that's-
Oh yeah, just one. Works for me. All right, well, I think she can catch up when she comes back. All right, so here we have the aftermath of where the second bomb would go off, Nagasaki. And as you can tell, it just got rid of everything. I mean, if it was extremely sturdy stone or concrete, it was torn down. If it was too close, it was evaporated. Everything was covered in radiation. And of course, radioactive dust would be swept up in the wind and carried into other areas. So it's extremely deadly, poisonous, destructive, and shocking. When the first bomb went off, the leaders of the country didn't believe it. They didn't think something like that existed. They thought it was a trick. And so, even though nearly 100,000 Japanese people died in the initial explosion, another 100,000 would perish from the radiation. Remember, that's about 200,000 people. That means only 50,000 lived. Yeah.
So that big bomb did that? Okay, because, I've,
Yeah,
in the past, I've been in classes where they taught about when they taught us about World War II and stuff. I just
Yeah.
never listened that closely.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what's scary. This is one of the first ones. So this is one of the little ones. Now they're just insanely bigger than that, and this was a city, a 250,000 people city. It's just one bomb, boop.
Yeah.
And now they're stronger for some reason because we're crazy. We're a crazy thing.
Okay, we won't ever use that.
I hope not. I can't imagine a justifiable reason.
Yeah.
When they're that destructive, you can't even make a good reason to do it, really. I mean, they take out a whole continent. How can that could never be good. All right. So, again, Japan, not believing this really happened because they just thought it was too crazy, asked the Soviets to help them make peace with the Americans. Stalin responded by declaring war on Japan because they already made a secret agreement with us that they would. And so then they invade Manchuria. They invaded Manchuria because it's in China, but they wanted to help communist forces there. We're going to find out later, led by Mao. On August the 9th, 1945, the Americans launched the second and last atomic bomb used in warfare on the city of Nagasaki. This blast killed nearly 60,000 people and forced Emperor Hirohito to make the final decision and surrender. On August 14th, 1945, this was the last day of World War II, Japan surrendered while the U.S. agreed to leave the emperor in this position. So the emperor of Japan was it wasn't just like a political position, which it was. It was also like a supreme religious position. The emperor was held in extreme reverence. Many Japanese essentially worshipped him, but most of them never even heard his voice until the radio address on 1945 when he told his people to stand down. And because of their reverence for him and their obedience, the transition to peace was actually really quick. There wasn't like a big underground movement of Japanese attacking Americans. They allowed us to come ashore. We built a naval base, and they accepted our aid after the war to help them rebuild. It was kind of weird. It was just like nothing happened. It's like the weirdest thing. So, but I think that's just because it's just something about Japanese culture, I guess. So, but that's our last slide for World War II. After this is the Cold War, but we're not going to talk about that until we come back from Christmas break. So it'll be January. And so we're going to learn about what happened with Russia and America and China and many other places. Why are we going to build super giant crazy nukes? Why do people do that? It's called containment and MAD, mutually assured destruction. All right, folks. Wow, this looks choppy. That's going to do it for today's lecture. So make sure you study. I'm going to remind you through Google Classroom what you need to study, and then take our test on Tuesday. See you later. In fact, this is probably going to be the last lecture until January.